everybody. Our program this evening is the Home Front. And we're going to talk about World War II. I'm sure we've all read books and seen movies of World War II and everything that went on in Europe and the Pacific. But we don't always know what happened here at home during the war. And I think you'll be surprised as to how things were here at the time. Today, I'm sure we've all lived through the Vietnamese War, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, and it's there. But during World War II, it pretty much consumed everyone's life, whether you were in the military or you were a civilian. And so as I researched things, I was really surprised by what went on here in Oakmont. But the first week of December 1941 was much like any other week here in Oakmont. The Oakmont High School football team had their football banquet scheduled for Friday evening at the United Presbyterian Church. The Oakmont Yacht Club had its annual Commodore's Ball on December 6th. Eaton Funeral Home took delivery of a brand new Buick ambulance, and an editorial in the Advance Leader urged Oakmont residents to support the local merchants during the upcoming Christmas season. They wanted you to spend your money here in Oakmont rather than go to the department stores in the city. So it was an average weekend like every other weekend in town. On Sunday, December 7th, a number of Oakmont residents tuned in to Sammy Kaye's Sunday Serenade on the NBC radio network. At 2:29 p.m., the program was interrupted with a news bulletin. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. From that moment, Oakmont, along with the rest of the world, would never be the same. President Roosevelt called it a day that will live in infamy. And anyone who was alive at the time, I'm sure you can tell me what you were doing and where you were when you heard the news. Shock, outrage, and fear quickly gave way to a strong sense of patriotism. Len Anderson, the editor of the Advance Leader, wrote in an editorial on December 12th, "It is war now, not half-war, not sugar-coated, not lend-lease business, not kid-glove stuff, but war, stern and total war, and we are all in it to the finish." And they were all in it to the finish. Not just the military, not just the government, but the entire population would become involved in the war effort. The residents of Oakmont went into action just days after the attack. On the evening of Wednesday, December 10th, a meeting was held at the American Legion, and they formed the Civil Defense Organization of Oakmont. The group's mission was to work with the Army, the state, and the county to defend Oakmont in the event of attack. Community volunteers were urged to sign up, and all-out victory was the rallying cry of the organization. During that first week, armed guards appeared on the Halton Bridge, the Bessemer High-Level Bridge, at Edgewater, Scaife, Woodings, and Ingalls Iron Works. And these guards, for the most part, were veterans from World War I, and they came out and volunteered to guard these facilities against sabotage. Also during that week, all Japanese merchandise was removed from the shelves at G.C. Murphy Company in Oakmont. The Women's Club of Oakmont also went into action. They established a Red Cross auxiliary to secure blood donors, and they sponsored first aid classes here in the basement of the library. The club set up a sewing and knitting center at the St. Thomas Parish House, and they made clothing and blankets for the war victims in Europe. On December 19th, the Oakmont Civilian Defense Organization met again, and Jack Kaufman was appointed chairman of the group. Members of the Boy Scouts, the Rotary, the Lions, the Fire Department, the American Legion, businessmen and residents offered their services to the organizations. One of the first things they did is they sent questionnaires home with the students to find out what type of services the people of Oakmont could offer to help defend the community. State Senator John Walker, who was a resident of Oakmont, told the group that he would obtain an air raid listening post for Oakmont so we would know if they were coming to bomb us. All truck owners were required to register their trucks with the Oakmont Civilian Defense Organization for emergency use in case of an attack. So they wanted to know who had trucks and who could help out if we were attacked. Non-naturalized citizens and alien residents were ordered to turn in all their guns, their cameras, and their shortwave transmitters to Chief Charles Helwig at the Oakmont Police Station. The advance leader urged residents not to hoard food, and at the end of December, the federal government banned the sale of automobile tires due to the shortage of rubber. On January 2nd, nearly 1 month after the attack, Mr. and Mrs. W.R. Campbell of Oakmont received a telegram from their son Robert. Robert was stationed at Pearl Harbor. He survived the attack and was safe, but for nearly a month they had no idea whether he was alive or not. The week of January 4th was designated as a week of prayer here in Oakmont, and church services were held each evening throughout the community. The Women's Club reported that during the month of December, they recruited 87 blood donors and 350 people signed up for their first aid class. The Oakmont Library began a drive to collect books for the soldiers. And the Boy Scouts here in Oakmont established a radio club to learn radio codes so they could transmit and receive messages should Oakmont be attacked. Flyers were passed out with sketches of enemy planes so that if residents could identify a plane flying overhead, they would know whether it was a German plane or not. So during the early days of World War II, there was a genuine fear that German bombers were going to attack the East Coast and Japanese were going to attack the West Coast. Ross Loeffler was the chairman of the Allegheny Council of Defense, and he said in a speech in early 1942, he said, "It is known Hitler has bombers which can fly from the coast of France to Pittsburgh and back again. The weather is now unfavorable for flying from the east to the west, and the danger of air attacks on the United States will increase as the spring season arrives." So they thought that German bombers would be here. So what they did, they instituted a system of air raid wardens. And the plan was, if they came to bomb, they would sound the air raid siren. When you heard the siren, you were supposed to turn off all the lights in your house and take cover. They appointed air raid wardens who were responsible for enforcing the blackout. And so what they had an assigned territory in town, they would go around, make sure everybody had their lights off. There were 26 air raid wardens here in Oakmont, and you may know some of the names of the air raid wardens. William Bryson, Arthur Fessemeyer, Vance Goebel, Parker Grubbs, Joe Grubbs, Charles King, Durbin Kerr, Al Lorch, Art McGivern, Paul Nicholas, Harry Reid, George C., and Jack Smith. So anytime that the air raid siren would go off, they had helmets and they had flashlights, and out they would go to make sure all the lights were off. The wardens swore an oath of allegiance to the government and underwent training at the 10th Street School. And after that, they set up a command center in the basement of the Borough Building. Dr. Leigh Gilmore was the superintendent of the Oakmont School District, and he devised an evacuation plan for the schools, which he presented to the Civil Defense Organization. And the plan called for complete evacuation of the schools in the event of an attack, because they felt that the students would be safer scattered out in homes around the school rather than being congregated in one building should the bombers come. Residents were instructed to remove all flammable materials from their attics, which would reduce the chance of fire if their house was bombed. They were also told to have sand and a shovel ready to extinguish any fires that might be caused by incendiary bombs. You may remember O.S. Grubbs & Son, the insurance agency. They began to offer war damage policies, where you could buy an insurance policy, and if your house was bombed by the Germans, it would pay you for repairs. They set up an air raid watch station on the hill atop Valley Heights Golf Course. And volunteers would go up there with binoculars and just scan the skies looking for German planes. And a good number of those volunteers were women. On March 6th, 1942, a defense rally was held at the high school auditorium. The program included a film of the German bombing of Nottingham, England, and over 500 residents of Oakmont attended the program. The speaker was a man by the name of Adolf Schmidt, and he was the Allegheny County Chief Air Raid Warden. And Mr. Schmidt warned the people of Oakmont of air raids in the spring. He said, "The danger is real and the necessity for protection is urgent." The first air raid drill was held on May 29th, 1942. The sirens were sounded and residents took cover and turned off all their lights. Oakmont continued to prepare for an attack. The Oakmont Police Department enrolled in a war traffic school, which was sponsored by the FBI. And this class instructed policemen on how to move traffic through a war zone, should there be a battle here. They also established the Oakmont Auxiliary Police Force, and they were established to help assist with civil defense here in Oakmont. There was a construction company by the name of McCready Rogers. I don't know if you remember that, but they were assigned to repair any infrastructure in town that would be damaged by enemy bombing or sabotage. Immediately after the attack, as we all know, volunteers flocked to recruiting stations. However, the first draft was held on January 23rd, 1942, and 11 men from Oakmont were drafted into the service. A second draft took place on April 3rd, and 12 more men were drafted from Oakmont. And what they did, each week the names of the draftees and the volunteers were printed up on the front page of the advance leader, so everyone knew who was going off to war. The mayor at the time was a gentleman by the name of Ray Stoop. And Mayor Stoop appointed Fred Favo Sr. to form a committee and work with the American Legion to plan send-off parties for the men who were going off to war. And what they would do is they would hold a parade. And the high school band, the police, the fire department, any organization in town would march in the parade, and they would all march to Grubbs Hall, which was located in Grubbs Arcade on the second floor. And then they would have a big party for the men who were leaving. The residents and merchants would donate gifts to the soldiers, to the recruits, things like tablets, pencils, combs, razors, anything that they might need when they went off to war. So each time that a group of soldiers went off to war, Mr. Favo and his committee made sure they had a proper send-off. As we know, all young men were required to register for the draft. However, I was surprised to learn that on April 17th, the War Department ordered that all men between the ages of 45 and 67 had to register for the draft and be ready if called up. At that time, the government began rationing a number of consumer goods, and I'm sure anybody who lived during the Second World War remembers that. Rubber, anything like that were rationed. Each resident received a ration book with coupons, and you were only allowed to buy what you were allocated. Also, any retail stores weren't allowed to raise any prices for the duration of the war unless they had the approval of the government. The nation's industries converted to full military production. The car companies quit making cars. They made tanks and jeeps and ships and anything needed for the war effort. We had 4 major factories here in Oakmont at the time, and they all joined the war effort. Ingalls Iron Works made armor plating for tanks and ships. Wooding's Tool Works made tools for the Army, Navy, and Air Corps. Scaife converted their production from water tanks to bomb casings. And Edgewater of course, made train wheels, but they also made ring springs, which were used in machine guns and airplane landing gear. At the beginning of the war, Edgewater had a workforce of about 1,100 men. During the course of the war, 497 of those men went off to fight. So as a result, they had a severe labor shortage. And the women of Oakmont were hired in to replace those men who went off to fight. And they came in and they did all the jobs that the men did. Crane operators, inspectors, laborers, they stepped right in and did everything. The term, I'm sure you probably heard, Rosie the Riveter, became a popular icon at the time, and they even had a song, Rosie the Riveter. And this was in reference to all the women who went to work in the factories. What's interesting is, when the war ended, they all left. They gave the jobs back to the returning veterans. A gentleman by the name of Frank Bell was the owner and president of Edgewater Steel Company. He resigned his position and went to Washington, D.C. to serve as the chief of ordnance in charge of securing industrial supplies for the Army. So what his job was, if the Army needed train wheels, he would find train wheels for them. If the Army needed metal, whatever they needed, it was his job to locate it. So he had a very important position with the Army. The citizens were asked to finance the war through the purchase of war bonds. And an organization was set up to sell war bonds in Oakmont. And these bonds were sold at schools, at businesses, and at the stores. You could purchase them one of two ways. You could go out and just buy a bond, or if you couldn't afford one, you would buy stamps. And you would fill up a little book. And when you had your book filled, you could buy a war bond. The stamp books were very popular with students. And on the first day of stamp sales, the Oakmont school children purchased $500 worth of stamps in just one day. Bond rallies were held in Oakmont throughout the war. And these rallies consisted of patriotic songs and speeches and things like that. And a lot of the celebrities from the time, movie stars, they traveled the country and they would attend these bond rallies and urge people to purchase war bonds. On September 11th, 1942, a victory bond parade was held here in Oakmont. It featured marching bands from Oakmont, Verona, Penn Hills, Boy Scouts, the Firemen, the Lions, the Rotary, the Kiwanis. Every group participated. The rally was sponsored by the theaters here in Oakmont, the Oaks, the Liberty, and the Olympic in Verona. And that rally, one rally, generated $15,000 in bond sales. So it shows how the people supported the war. During the week of December 11th, 1942, approximately 1 year after Pearl Harbor, the Oaks Theater sponsored Remember Pearl Harbor Week. And they offered free admission to the movie to anyone who would purchase a war bond in the lobby. And although the residents, they were sacrificing for the war effort, they realized that their sacrifices were really nothing to the men who were on the front line. And they felt that these people who were fighting should be recognized in some way. Now, Mr. Grubbs had a poster in his window of his office, and he listed all the men from Oakmont who were fighting in the war. Well, the residents decided that they needed an honor roll for the men and women who were fighting. So they raised money, and they had a community honor roll built. And it was located on Allegheny River Boulevard next to the Oaks Theater. If you know where the yogurt place is, before that was a vacant lot at the time, and they put a huge honor roll in there with the list of all the men and women from Oakmont who were fighting in the war. There were 450 people listed on that honor roll. And when they dedicated it, over 1,000 people from the town came out for the ceremony. And again, everybody had a connection to the war. Every family had a son, a grandson, a daughter, a granddaughter, a nephew. Everybody had somebody in the war. So there was a personal connection with all these people in the war. One of the families, you may know them, their name was Curti, Mr. and Mrs. Frank Curti, and they had 4 sons serving in the war. Frank Jr. was in the Marines, Jules in the Navy, Louis in the Coast Guard, and Victor in the Army Air Corps. So as you can see, everybody, and I'm sure anybody that was alive at the time remembers that, there was somebody from their family in the war. Sadly, the war came home to Oakmont on April 30th, 1943, when the first serviceman died in the war. John Knicely of Archie Street was killed when his airplane crashed in the Pacific Ocean after returning from a bombing mission. Not long after that, another Oakmont resident by the name of John McCandless, age 20, was taken prisoner by the Japanese. He was held in a POW camp near Tokyo, and he was captured during the Japanese invasion of the Aleutian Islands. McCandless survived the war in the camp and returned when the war was over. In 1943, the Memorial Day services, back then, before it was a Monday holiday, it was held on May 31st. Well, the factories were under such demand to produce that they couldn't give people a day off to observe Memorial Day. So what they decided to do is they moved it to a Sunday just so the people could come to the parade and go to the ceremony. And you know, that just shows how they had to fill those production requirements from the Army. That same year, the Oakmont-Verona-Kennywood picnic was scheduled for July 29th. But they canceled it because of gasoline restrictions. Because at the time, gasoline was rationed and people couldn't take unnecessary trips. So people couldn't have the gasoline to get to Kennywood. Well, the community leaders thought about it and they said these people are working hard and things that they have to do. So they decided that they would reschedule the Kennywood picnic, and they scheduled it for August 19th. And then what they did was the Chamber of Commerce provided bus transportation to Wilkinsburg, where they switched over to trolleys and rode trolleys over to Kennywood, all free of charge. And they also provided tickets to the children of Oakmont and Verona, just to give the people a break from everything that was going on. On a brighter note, a new Liberty ship was named for Oakmont resident Robert L. Vann. Now, Mr. Vann was the publisher of the Pittsburgh Courier, and he lived here in Oakmont. And so he had passed away in 1940, and the Navy named one of the Liberty ships after Mr. Vann. If you studied World War II, it were the Liberty ships that transported all the cargo from North America over to Europe. And they were the ships that were the targets of Hitler's U-boats. We lost a lot of those ships to Hitler's U-boats. Do we have any members of the Garden Club here this evening? Oh, nobody made it. Well, in the spring of 1943, the Oakmont Garden Club formed the Victory Garden Committee. And the purpose was to help residents plant victory gardens. What the government had done had asked people to try to grow some food on your own so that more food would be available for the soldiers who were fighting. So the Garden Club asked that residents not plant flowers this summer and plant vegetables instead. And they sought out vacant land here in Oakmont for these victory gardens. And Mr. Phones, Henry Phones, donated a large plot up on Wade Lane, and then Edgewater and Scaife provided land for victory gardens. And the purpose of a victory garden, if someone lived in an apartment or maybe had a small yard, they weren't able to plant a garden, they could go to this community garden, they were given a plot, and they were able to plant their garden. The Garden Club also published in the Advanced Leader diagrams of how to plant their gardens and what to plant. And so many rows of beans, so many of corn, and things like that. And also what they did is they sponsored canning classes so that the housewives could take that stuff that they grew and preserve it. And so they had canning classes for that. The Oakmont American Legion participated in a drive to send cigarettes to soldiers. Their goal was to send 40 million cigarettes to the men and women fighting in the war. So the residents donated money. And back then, cigarettes cost 5 cents a pack. So they were able to buy a number of cigarettes. They also announced plans to build a soldiers' recreation center in their building over on Isabella Street. And the purpose of the center would be for any soldiers who were home on leave. They could go there and meet with other soldiers. And then what they had hoped was after the war it would become a veterans center. By mid-1943, the tide had started to turn a little bit, and the fear of an attack on the homeland started to dissipate. They weren't as worried now that they were coming to bomb us, but they still knew that it was a hard fight ahead. And again, financing the war was a huge cost, and so war bond sales continued at a rapid pace. The First National Bank of Oakmont offered anyone who would buy a war bond at the bank free tickets to the Hollywood Cavalcade show at Forbes Field. And it starred Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland, and Hedy Lamarr. At the same time, the Oakmont Fire Department supported the war effort by sponsoring scrap metal and paper drives. And residents were asked to take all the old scrap metal and paper and place it out on the curb, and the firemen would come by and pick it up. They held a paper drive on August 27th, and they collected 13,000 pounds of paper in just one day. As I said, the residents of Oakmont were doing their part to support the war. However, the brave soldiers were fighting and dying on the battlefields around the world. Each week, the advance leader printed the names of those who were drafted and volunteered, but it also printed the names of the casualty report. And that included local soldiers who were killed, wounded, taken prison, or missing in action. The newspaper reported 13 servicemen from the Oakmont area were killed in action during the week of September 15th, 1944. 2 weeks later, 5 more servicemen from the community lost their lives. So we had a number, as I keep saying, how many people went off to war. And the people from Oakmont served in all levels. And I just have a couple of people here and how they served in the war. One of the gentlemen is a man by the name of George Elsie. I don't know if anybody knows George. George graduated from Oakmont High School in 1936. He attended Princeton and he joined the Naval Reserves, where he became an officer. Well, George was assigned to the communications in the map room at the White House. And George's job was to transcribe and deliver messages between President Roosevelt, Chiang Kai-shek, Stalin, and Churchill. So everything that came from those world leaders came through George Elsie. And he was a resident of Oakmont. After Roosevelt passed away, he continued on in that position with President Truman. And it was George Elsie that informed Harry Truman that the bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. So an Oakmont resident was the person who told President Truman the bomb had been dropped. George lives out in California, and we're proud to say he's a member of the Oakmont Historical Society. And he corresponds with us regularly. I think he's 96 or 97, and we keep in touch with him. He's not online, but we write the old-fashioned way, and he sends letters. But he's a real gentleman. Another one was a guy by the name of Glen Monks. Glen Monks lived up on 9th Street, and he always wanted to be a pilot. Well, he graduated in 1939, and that's when the war was starting over in Europe before the United States was involved. So he went to Canada, and he volunteered with the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was a pilot, and he was in the war before the United States was in. Unfortunately, he was killed in a plane crash. And Glenn is buried up here at the cemetery at the top of the hill. And each year, the Canadian government sends a Canadian flag down to the Oakmont Cemetery, and they place it on his grave for Canadian Memorial Day. So I think that's either 2 weeks or before or 2 weeks after our Memorial Day. And from what I understand, he's buried near the building there. So if you're ever up there at Memorial Day, you know, try to find his grave, and you'll see the Canadian flag on there. Another gentleman was Roger Duffy. I'm sure a lot of you remember Roger Duffy. He was mayor here in Oakmont for a number of years, and then he went on to serve in the state legislature. But Roger was drafted at the age of 17, and he was assigned to the Company B of the 27th Armored Battalion. And he arrived in Europe during the Battle of the Bulge. Now, if you remember, as the Allies landed and started to advance across France and into Germany, the Germans started to retreat. And as they retreated, they would blow up bridges and destroy everything to slow down the Allies' advance. How many people have seen the movie The Bridge at Remagen, which is the story of one of the bridges they forgot, or for some reason they didn't blow up? Well, the Company B of the 27th Armored Battalion stumbled across the bridge at Remagen and saw it still standing. So they crossed the bridge while the Germans were underneath trying to set off the explosives and taking fire from Germans up on the hilltop. And they were able to cross the bridge and capture the bridge, and it became a major bridgehead for the advance into Germany. And Roger Duffy was part of that small company that helped capture the bridge. Another gentleman was by the name of Charles Potiphal. And Charles was in the invasion of Sicily and Italy. And he was in Sicily, and he received a letter from his sister, Agnes Bracata, here in Oakmont. And they had cousins who were born here in Oakmont and returned to Sicily. So she sent him a letter and said that they're in the little village of Sheffield. How do I say it, Vince? Sheffield, okay. And asked if Charlie could check on them. So he went to the village, and it was deserted. And he went down the main street calling out their names. And he said, "I'm a cousin, I'm from home," you know, and no one was around. Well, finally somebody popped their head out, and he said, "I'm trying to find Jean and Sarah Liberto." So the man took them to their house. Well, they were overjoyed to see him, and they offered him to stay and have dinner with them. Although sadly, when they sat down to dinner, they had very little to eat. And he found out that the entire village was just terrorized by the Nazis when they had control of it. And people had no food. So he left, and he went back to his base, and he got a couple of his buddies, and they borrowed, I think it's called a deuce and a half, which is the big army truck, and they backed it up to the commissary, and they borrowed some more food, and they drove into the village, and they passed out the food to all the villagers and gave them food that they badly needed. So, and later Sarah and Jean came back to Oakmont and settled here. We had people involved in all levels of the war. And eventually the American war machine gained momentum and the tide began to turn. Plans were underway for the invasion of Europe. And there was a naval officer, Lieutenant T.H. Campbell, and he was of the Navy Ordnance Department. And he came to Ingalls Iron Works here along Plum Street because they were a major supplier to the Navy. And he gave a speech at the factory on April 12th, 1944. And he said, "The 0 hour of invasion of Hitler's European fortress is near. And when it comes, it will be a grim win all or lose all proposition." So they knew it was coming, but they didn't know if it was going to be a success. And the Oakmonters anxiously awaited the invasion of Europe. At 12:41 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the NBC radio network broke with a news bulletin. The invasion was underway. The residents awoke the following morning with news that the Allies were storming the beaches of Normandy. That evening, President Roosevelt took to the airwaves and asked the citizens to pray for victory. And in the ensuing days, the residents of Oakmont, along with the rest of the country, anxiously listened to reports of the Allied invasion. The landing was a success, and the drive across Europe was underway. And with that, life started to get back to normal here in Oakmont. The Oakmont Chamber of Commerce resumed their meetings, which had been canceled due to the war. The Oakmont PTA also resumed their meetings. Oakmont Council got back to regular business, and they approved zoning changes for a new home for the elderly to be built on Halton Road next to the Oakmont Country Club. The state of Pennsylvania announced plans for an airport to be built near Oakmont after the war. The Oakmont Lions Club inducted 14 new members, and the residents were slowly returning to their normal lives, but they knew it would still be a long, hard fight. However, by May 1945, victory was imminent. The residents of Oakmont were notified that if the victory in Europe came and was announced before 6 p.m., a special church service sponsored by the Oakmont Ministerial Association would be held at the Oakmont Methodist Church. If the announcement came in the evening, the service would be held the following day. On May 8, 1945, victory in Europe was declared. The war in Europe was over. The celebration in Oakmont was subdued. The residents were thankful that the end had come, but they knew the battle was only half over. The war against the Japanese war machine still raged across the Pacific theater. Plans were announced for a 7th war bond drive. The firemen planned another scrap drive for May 26th and May 27th. Young men from Oakmont continued to be drafted and volunteer for service, and casualty lists still filled the front page of the Advance Leader. The residents continued their support of the war. On August 6, 1945, as I said, George Elsie of Oakmont informed President Harry Truman that the atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. A second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and these two new weapons forced the surrender of the Japanese armed forces. VJ Day was declared, victory over Japan. The headline of the Advance Leader proclaimed, "Cyclone sweeps the community as news of peace is told." The editor, Led Anderson, wrote on the front page, "A cyclone swept the community Tuesday night, August 14th, shortly after 7 o'clock. It was a cyclone of joy and unrestrained noise, whistles, horns, and yells, of spontaneously gotten up automobile parades, horns blaring, tin cans, paint cans, and old garbage cans bouncing and sparking at the rear of cars, of hundreds of people congregating on the streets, hugging and kissing and dancing and screaming for joy. But the joy was not all noise. There was in many hearts the emotion that brought tears to the eyes, a weeping of gladness felt especially by the mothers and the fathers and the wives of the boys who for long months and dragged out years had been doing the job on land, on sea, and from the air. And there were tears, not altogether of gladness, in the eyes of those whose boys won't be coming home. And those boys who did not come home to Oakmont were M. Agazzuli, Robert Brown, James Carroll, Denny Clark, Richard Kramer, William Ecker, Ted Hankey, Frank Kern, John Knicely, John Kopus, Robert Krause, Raymond Cush, Edward Langley, Herbert Lelliott, Thomas Marchese, Glen Monks, Joseph Potiphal, L.H. Puryear Jr., Tom Seaver, Larry Sukop, Edward Walters, and Russell J. Welsh. After 4 years of sacrifice, the war had ended. The United States emerged from the war a world power. 670 men and women from Oakmont fought in the Second World War. What is amazing is that represents 10% of the community went off and fought in the war. 1 in 10 went to war. 22 men lost their lives and didn't return. Those in the community who did not go off to war all did their part to support the war effort on the home front. Thank you.